Just 2 words, it only required that. One of the most influential sports owners on the planet at the moment casually said 2 words into a live microphone. Not a planned statement, not a press conference, and not a well-rehearsed soundbite meant to look flawless in front of a camera. In an honest moment, just 2 words were said. It's the kind of event that lawyers covertly mark on their calendars and PR teams dread. None, and those 2 words, nearly 4, just gave the WNBA ownership group the most powerful bargaining tool ever used against a players' union in the history of women's professional sports. However, before we reach those lines and follow the money all the way to the real conclusion of this tale, you must comprehend something that very few reporters are bothering to explain. The celebration you are currently witnessing, the press announcements, the social media triumph laps, and the union leadership walking in front of cameras grinning broadly. That is a genuine celebration. The funds are genuine. The achievement is truly historic. None of that is being contested. The question that lies right behind all of that excitement is what is being carefully avoided and discreetly removed from the popular narrative before it becomes uncomfortable. Not if the money is there. It's obvious that the money exists. Where it originated is the question. Because the union's victory lap is not the only thing that is complicated by the answer to that question. It completely undermines the argument they intend to present in the 2026 collective bargaining talks. Additionally, the owners are already aware of it. Since the revenue figures began to come in, they have been aware of it. They know something about negotiating leverage that the union's public messaging has utterly ignored. So they have been calmly waiting for the celebration, the checks to be made, and the social media cycle to unfold. You don't truly win anything when you give someone a weapon and then celebrate in front of them. You simply increase the cost of the inevitable conflict. Let's do the arithmetic all the way back to the original location of this trap. 2020 is the year. The Players Association and the WNBA are negotiating a new collective bargaining agreement while sitting across from one another. The planet is currently experiencing a pandemic. All throughout the world, professional sports leagues are frantically trying to determine their financial prospects. There is no longer any attendance. Funds for sponsorships are disappearing. No one had ever modeled the conditions under which broadcast deals are being renegotiated. And amid all of that turmoil, the parties reach an agreement that most financial analysts instantly disregarded as a temporary compromise. A revenue-sharing trigger was hidden within the new CBA. The mechanics were clearly explained. Only if the league as a whole met a very certain compound growth standard would players receive 50% of the additional revenue. Starting with the 2019 baseline, that goal was to expand by 20% annually every year, compounded. In a league that has operated as a subsidized financial black hole for almost 30 years, every single year is compounded for 5 consecutive years. In a league where no one was purchasing shirts in significant quantities. And in a league where sales of items were so pitiful that they hardly identified as a line item worth talking about in serious financial discussions. On the ownership side, the authors of the clause knew exactly what they were doing. They were giving the union a piece of what they knew in secret would never come to pass. It's a traditional tactic in negotiations. On paper, you make a generous conditional commitment to the other party, but you know that it will never be fulfilled. The union is able to inform its members that revenue sharing has been secured. The owners are spared from having to pay revenue sharing. Everyone appears to have won something as they leave the table. However, one side truly prevailed, and the other received a very costly sheet of paper with a trigger that was never meant to activate. At the time, financial analysts covering women's professional basketball were frank about the odds. Not cautious in public, but hopeful in private. Sincerely, and bluntly direct. There was not the necessary amount of consumer demand for WNBA items. For almost 30 years, the product had been carefully handled without producing the kind of natural fan investment that propels large-scale retail sales. It was not only audacious to aim for 20% compound yearly growth. It was the type of figure that is inserted into a contract when one party wishes to look giving while maintaining financial security. That was the 2020 CBA. That served as the cornerstone for all subsequent developments. Then something occurred that no one in the boardroom had anticipated. Something that no expert had anticipated. Something that would transform that phantom clause into the most significant contractual provision in the league's history. Indianapolis took place. You must comprehend the financial reality of the WNBA prior to Indianapolis in order to comprehend its significance in this context. Not the league's declared goals, not the upbeat forecasts that appear in press releases over All-Star Weekend. The real figures, the ones that reveal what customers actually did with their money when they had the option to invest in women's professional basketball. Between 2016 and 2019, the WNBA as a whole made $280,000 in group license money from 4 complete seasons of professional basketball played by gifted athletes competing at the top level of their sport. 4 years, $280,000 for the whole league, every team. Every player, every jersey, trading card, licensed product, and branded item of goods for the course of 4 full professional seasons. To put that into perspective, in a single product launch weekend, a single mid-level social media influencer with a few 100,000 active followers can make more than that by selling their own branded goods. That served as the starting point. In the absence of an outside economic trigger, that was the product as it was. When in terms of consumer demand for items, decades of professional women's basketball had created that. Then, for the first time in its 28-year existence, the WNBA made enough money during the 2025 season to activate the benchmark that had lain dormant in the 2020 CBA. The 13 teams in the league were given access to an $8 million pool. Concurrently, the Players Association declared a $9 group licensing payout, $25,280,000 over the course of 4 whole seasons. So as opposed to $9,250,000 in group license money in a single recent era, years before. That is a 3,200% increase that wasn't the result of rounding errors or advantageous comparisons made by selecting particular data points. The demand for licensed WNBA items has increased by 3,200%, and a single calendar year accounted for the great majority of that rise. A press conference was conducted by the Players Association. In front of the cameras, the union leadership took a step. The headlines were self-written. For the first time in 28 years, historic revenue sharing was activated. Millions will be distributed to players through licensing. The WNBA shows up as a respectable business. It went viral on social media. The implications for the future of women's professional sports were explored by sports commentators. The story was clear, captivating, and emotionally fulfilling. Decades of hardship. After decades of players taking below-market pay in order to create something they were passionate about, there has finally been a financial breakthrough that has validated everything. Depending on whose side of the boardroom you were seated on, it was either the first move in a very high-stakes game of chess or a victory celebration. It was a truly emotional moment. The owners allowed the cameras to run. They released the press releases. To contest the union's framing, they did not convene an urgent meeting. They knew something about the 3,200% increase that the union's communications team was cautiously omitting from the press release. So they sat quietly with their internal data and waited. They were fully aware of its origin. This is the question that none of the conventional sports media outlets following this story have been able to pose directly. What particularly changed if the WNBA just had a 3,200% increase in group license revenue? Which product improved? What was the breakthrough in marketing? What tactical move did the league use to change consumer behavior on such a large scale? There's always a specific response when a business indicator changes by 32 times in a condensed period of time. Without a clear reason, markets do not naturally produce 32 times the customer demand for a product that has been on the market and professionally promoted for 30 years. The framing of the union suggests a communal response. Through their collective effort and commitment, the players created something. Every boat was buoyed by the growing awareness of women's sports. Improved television deals, expanded social media followings, and more media attention. A new financial reality for the league as a whole resulted from the convergence of all these elements. And that story isn't totally untrue. There has been a real rise in the general public's interest in women's professional sports. The amount of media coverage has increased. The WNBA is receiving more attention now than it was 5 years ago. However, 32 times the retail revenue cannot be explained by more eyes. The needle is not moved by 3,200% due to cultural momentum. From $280,000 to $9 is not what you get. $25 million as a result of increased transmission and widespread knowledge agreements. You arrived there as a result of a certain event that led to the creation of a particular category of consumer demand that had never before existed in that volume. The sudden decision by millions of fans to purchase products from backup power forwards, reserve point guards, or seasoned role players who have been in the league for 10 years did not trigger the licensing revenue rise. The $9, one player's jerseys, one player's trading cards, and one player's branded merchandise sold at a level that the WNBA had never experienced in its 28-year history, generating nearly all of the $25 million in revenue. The athlete whose gear was being bought by fans in Iowa, Indiana, and across the nation who had never owned a single piece of WNBA merchandise before she donned a professional uniform was the name on those jerseys and the face on those trading cards, Clark Caitlin. Where the union is commemorating more than simply a monetary achievement, they are trying to leverage the economic impact of a single player, her sales of jerseys, cards, and licensed merchandise, as the basis for a long-term structural reorganization of the league's long-term financial structure. Look at what we built collectively. Look at what our labor is worth. Now open the vault permanently and give us 27.12% of gross revenue going forward. They are telling the ownership group, are pointing to revenue generated by a single individual. Meanwhile, the owners are seated across the table with internal data that breaks that revenue down by product category and by player. Tsai, the billionaire co-founder of the Alibaba Group, is not a casual sports fan who purchased a team because he wanted courtside seats and a celebrity hobby. Instead, they are reading the receipts, which tell a story that is very different from the one being told in front of the cameras. His entire professional career was built on one particular skill: looking at data about what consumers actually do with their money and identifying exactly where value is being assumed or projected. When a man like that speaks into a live microphone about financial metrics, he is not being careless. He is not making a casual remark that he will walk back in a prepared statement the next day. He is being precise. He is saying exactly what he means because he is the kind of person who has spent decades choosing words with the same care that other people choose investments. And his exact words are confirmed and publicly available. He did not stumble into owning the New York Liberty through some lucky opportunity or vanity investment. Since Caitlin Clark joined the league, viewership, ticket sales, and sponsorship have all increased nearly 4 times. Not nearly doubled, not significantly increased, not significantly improved, but nearly 4 times. This is a 4-fold increase in viewership, a 4-fold increase in ticket sales, and a 4-fold increase in sponsorship revenue, all of which have been publicly verified by a primary team owner using internal league data that he has direct access to as one of the most financially invested individuals in the organization. The union's entire bargaining position for 2026 is based on the claim that the league is experiencing historic collective growth that every player contributed to through years of dedication, labor, and sacrifice. The 27.12% gross revenue demand is built entirely on that premise. However, Tsai recently testified on record, supported by publicly available data, that the WNBA's baseline product as it existed in 2023 still exists. It did not grow organically through collective labor and dedication, and the 4 times multiplier above that baseline has a single name. Everyone seated at the 2026 bargaining table has already heard what he said in public and on a microphone. The owners will not use Tsai's remarks as an aggressive opening salvo in the negotiations because they are already in the public record. The supporting data is already in the public domain. Viewership numbers are tracked independently. Ticket sales figures are verifiable, and the sponsorship deal is in place. The $9.25 million licensing pool is not being divided solely among the players who are currently active in the WNBA. That would be complicated enough given the discussion about where the revenue actually came from, but the distribution mechanics that the union has outlined go much beyond active roster players. The question is not whether the ownership group can prove their argument, but rather whether the union can construct a counterargument that holds up when the receipts are sitting on the table. More than 250 people will receive direct deposits of up to $50,000 each from the union's licensing pool. This number includes players who are currently on active 2025 rosters, which makes sense. Players who have already retired from professional basketball, and players who have been released from their contracts entirely. If a fan in Iowa, Indiana, or anywhere else in the nation opens up their laptop or walks into a sporting goods store and buys a number 22 jersey, the union refers to this model as sharing in the growth, framing it as a way to honor the players who built the league through lean years when the money was scarce, and who made financial sacrifices to keep women's professional basketball alive when it would have been easier and more financially rewarding to pursue other opportunities. They are making that purchase because they want to wear the jersey of a particular player they are passionate about watching compete. This transaction generates retail revenue, which flows through the licensing structure into the union's group pool. There is a legitimate argument to be made that players who played in the league during its financially challenging decades should profit when the league eventually achieves a true commercial breakthrough. However, the ownership group is evaluating this argument through the same lens that Tsai applies to every business decision he makes. And through that lens, the union has created a mechanism that takes wealth generated by specific identifiable consumer demand for one individual and redistributes it to people who did not create that demand. For example, a fan purchasing a number 22 jersey is not expressing a collective appreciation for the history of women's professional basketball. The money trail from that transaction is clear and unambiguous. When it goes from the consumer's wallet to the licensing pool to a distribution that includes people who had nothing to do with the consumer making that particular choice. The ownership group did not have to create this argument. The union did it for them. When Tsai's remarks made it clear that one player owned the 4 times multiplier, the union's chosen distribution model became the most potent exhibit the owners could ever present at the 2026 bargaining table. We can understand why, but you cannot then claim that the revenue was generated widely and thus justifies a permanent restructuring of the financial relationship between players and owners across the entire league. That is the argument waiting at the 2026 table, and it becomes even more acute when you consider who is specifically in line to receive those $50,000 deposits. The 2024 WNBA season was one of the most closely watched in the league's history, not because of a championship race, a historic performance, or a historic broadcast deal. Overshadowed by the arrival of a single rookie, the tension was not quiet or behind the scenes. Rather, it was publicly displayed on courts, in post-game remarks, in social media interactions, and in the kind of hard fouls that send a message beyond the actual basketball play. Veteran players were clear about their viewpoint: the attention, the cameras, the sponsor dollars, and the media access. They felt it was disproportionate. They had invested their careers in a league that the larger sports world had largely ignored. Arrived, and the cameras came, and the sponsors came, and the reporters came, and suddenly the league they had spent years building was being discussed primarily in the context of someone who had just arrived. Their frustration was understandable. Their expression of it was public, and their claim on the league's history and their contribution to building it are not fabricated. Players who spent the lean years in the WNBA genuinely did sacrifice financially in ways that athletes in comparable men's leagues would not have accepted. The argument that they deserve to share in a financial breakthrough has legitimate moral weight. But here is the reality that the distribution model creates. The veteran players who spent the 2024 season most vocally questioning the media attention surrounding Caitlin. As it turns out, Sean, the answer came in the form of a direct deposit into their bank account. And the amount of that deposit was determined almost entirely by the number of fans who bought products bearing her name and likeness. That is not a small irony. Clark and the players who committed hard fouls to make a point demanded that the league and its coverage respect the veterans who had paid their dues. These are the same players who are currently waiting on licensing distribution deposits that were funded by the sale of her merchandise. The union's model required a collective framing because, without it, the individual player whose commercial value generated the revenue would have a strong case for a fundamentally different financial arrangement. However, the collective framing exposes every player in that distribution to the question the ownership group will ask at the bargaining table. If the revenue were collective, why would it require one player to exist? And if it required one player to exist, what happens to the revenue when the CBA that allows her to being paid at current rates is replaced by one that doesn't reflect her individual value in the structure? The union believes that a rising tide lifts all boats. Yes, and the owners have the receipts proving the tide has exactly one source. When those two positions formally meet in 2026, the result won't look anything like the celebration currently taking place on social media. To fully comprehend why the 2026 collective bargaining negotiation is shaping up to be the most contentious in WNBA history, you must look at the precise amount the union has attached to their demands. Administrative overhead. Gross revenue off the top before the ownership groups figure out what it really costs to run a professional sports franchise. The current revenue sharing arrangement is structured very differently. The trigger that just activated for the first time distributes 50% of incremental revenue above a specific growth threshold, which is a fundamentally different financial proposition than a baseline gross revenue share. A gross revenue share of 27.12% means the players get their cut from the first dollar generated, regardless of whether the franchise is profitable or not. For context, several WNBA franchises have historically operated at significant losses, even with the league's subsidized structure. The economics of running a professional women's basketball team at current compensation levels, with current arena costs and operational expenses, have not been universally favorable. And even for ownership groups with deep pockets, a 27.12% gross revenue mandate in a new CBA would fundamentally change the financial viability calculation for teams whose markets have not experienced the Clark effect that Indianapolis has documented. The union's argument, of course, is that the league's revenue growth makes this sustainable. And if the growth were genuinely collective and distributed across markets, that argument would have considerably more structural support. But the ownership group's counter is already built into the data. If the revenue spike is attributable primarily to one player's commercial draw, and if that player's presence in specific markets is what drove viewership, ticket. The New York Liberty's investment profile under Tsai shows a sincere commitment to building a competitive, well-compensated roster. The dispute is not about whether players deserve better compensation. Rather, it is about what the financial architecture of that compensation should look like and what it should be based on. If sales and sponsorship reach 4 times their previous levels, then a gross revenue share obligation structured as though the growth were organic and league-wide is being calculated on a foundation that does not reflect reality. The ownership group will argue that locking in a permanent structural commitment at peak numbers, when they can show that the peak was created by one player's specific commercial draw, creates a long-term liability that the underlying league economics cannot support in markets and seasons where that specific draw is absent. This argument becomes even more compelling when you consider what happens when the current CBA expires and the next one is being negotiated in a league that may look very different, depending on how individual player decisions and market dynamics evolve over the next several years. The owners are fully upholding their contractual obligation and permitting the distributions to go forward without question. But the trigger's activation is also the most potent piece of evidence they could have requested going into the 2026 negotiations. It demonstrates through time-stamped financial data that the league's revenue trajectory changed dramatically and that the change is attributable to a specific identifiable catalyst rather than collective organic growth. In response, the union immediately escalated their demands. On calling for a permanent restructuring of the financial relationship between players and ownership based on the milestone numbers generated during the most commercially unique period in league history. Of collective sacrifice and collective achievement to the bargaining table, and cited the revenue figures as proof. In response, Tsai spoke into a hot microphone nearly 4 times since Caitlin Clark joined the league. This statement is now in the permanent public record, and it is supported by data that can be independently verified. It was made by one of the ownership group's most financially astute and analytically rigorous members. It cannot be retracted. It cannot be reframed. And it gives every ownership group at the 2026 negotiating. The union created a distribution model that reroutes revenue from one player's commercial success to over 250 individuals, including retired and released players. This model was intended to show the value of collective licensing rights, but it unintentionally demonstrated the exact opposite. It showed that the ownership group can point to specific transactions, trace them to specific consumer demand, and show exactly how a collective distribution model is being funded by one individual's commercial footprint. The veteran players who publicly questioned Caitlin Clark's standing in the league are now getting licensing distributions from her merchandise sales. Irony, that is a documented, publicly debatable example of the exact argument the ownership group intends to make about why a permanent gross revenue share restructuring based on current numbers is not justified. Every piece of this puzzle was put together in public. Every data point is verifiable, and every statement is on record. The ownership group only needed to wait for Joe Tsai's microphone to go live and let the union make its moves. Now, they are sitting across a very large boardroom table with everything in front of them. The 2026 collective bargaining negotiation won't resemble a typical labor dispute between a professional sports league and its. This negotiation is different because the ownership group's main argument has already been made publicly voluntarily by one of their own members, without any of the strategic ambiguity that typically characterizes owner communications during CBA talks. Joe Tsai did not calculate the 4 times number and share it because he was being careless. Rather, he shared it because it is accurate and verifiable, and because having it in the public record before negotiations begin is strategically valuable for a negotiating party that wants to establish a factual baseline before the union's framing can take hold. The union's options are limited. They can argue that the growth, wherever it originated, benefits all players and thus justifies a collective share. But they are doing so against the backdrop of a distribution model that literally takes one player's merchandise revenue and sends it to 250 people. They can threaten a work stoppage, which may carry real weight if the membership is united and committed. However, a work stoppage in a league where the dominant commercial draw is a specific player creates asymmetric risks that a work stoppage in a larger, more commercially diverse league does not. The union's collective bargaining power would be fundamentally restructured in ways that go far beyond the current dispute about the 1.5% demand. If the union accepts individual market value provisions, they are acknowledging that collective licensing and collective revenue sharing are not the right frameworks for a league where one player's commercial footprint dwarfs the rest of the roster. The first, and more important, the counter to the 27.12% gross revenue demand will probably be structured with performance thresholds that only occur at growth levels that have historically been linked to particular market conditions rather than league-wide trends. It was built in 2020 with a phantom clause that no one thought would ever fire. It was confirmed when the clause fired and the ownership group saw exactly what data came with it. And it was given its most powerful weapon when Tsai spoke into a microphone and gave the ownership group's entire 2026 negotiating position in 2 words, nearly 4. If they reject individual market value provisions, they are forcing themselves to defend a collective model that the entire public record now documents as being funded by one individual's commercial success. Now that determines whether this financial moment becomes the basis of true long-term growth or the peak that the league looks back at from a more complicated future. What happens to the WNBA's revenue numbers without the specific commercial catalyst that generated them? This is not a cynical question. Rather, it is a financial planning question that every serious business in the world asks when its revenue is concentrated in a single customer, a single product, or a single market dynamic. Concentration risk is one of the most fundamental concepts in financial analysis. The WNBA is not a one-player enterprise in terms of its operational structure and long-term growth strategy. But the revenue figures that are currently being used to justify a permanent restructuring of the financial relationship between players and ownership were generated during a period of concentration that has no historical precedent in the league's existence. The ownership group is acutely aware of this. The league has made real progress on several fronts that existed prior to 2023. Broadcast deals have improved, expansion has continued, investment in team infrastructure and player development has increased, and new markets are coming online. The union's position is that the league has surpassed a threshold of commercial viability that will sustain growth even under different market conditions. The ownership group's position is that the evidence for that claim does not yet exist, and that locking in permanent financial commitments based on a concentration-driven peak is not responsible financial management. Both positions have legitimate foundations, and neither is going to yield easily. Their refusal to accept a permanent gross revenue share structured around current peak numbers is not merely a negotiating tactic. The gap between them is so great that the most serious outcome of all, a work stoppage before the 2026 season, cannot be written off as an unlikely edge case. The math has already been done on both sides of the table, The data are uncontested, and the interpretation of what it means for the league's financial future is where the two sides are separated by what may be an unbridgeable distance in the current negotiating environment. Something has to give. And the only question that truly matters heading into the most significant negotiating moment in the WNBA's 28-year history, the owners have the leverage of threatening a work stoppage. The fans who made every dollar of this historic revenue milestone by buying a jersey, a ticket, or a broadcast are waiting, possibly unknowingly, to find out if the financial dispute over who should get credit for their expenditures will cost them a season of professional basketball. The celebration was real. The money was real. The milestone was truly historic. And the trap underneath all of it was built 5 years ago by people who knew exactly what they were doing. The only question that remains is whether the union understood it.